And we're back. Wow, you know, it feels so good, Caleb, because, you know, we actually haven't shot a YouTube video in like 3 or 4 months. And I'm excited today because today I'm gonna be talking about the all-time easiest way to get into real estate. This is actually how I got my start. This is how so many of my friends that are crushing it in the real estate world got their start. I really couldn't be a bigger fan of this strategy because I genuinely believe it's a very low cost and achievable way to break into the real estate game. And it's called house hacking. Don't know why. House hacking. Boop, 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 boop. And today I'm gonna tell you how it changed my life, as well as give you a few strategies that you can use when house hacking. Cool? All right, but before we get into it, don't forget to like the video. I don't ever ask you to like the video. Consider this the first time in a long time that I've asked you to like the video at the beginning of the video versus making you sit till the end and then deciding, do I like? No, we're going all in because this is gonna be a good video. All right? Okay? Cool, cool. Where's the trigger? So let's start off with the basics here, which is what is house hacking? House hacking is effectively when you rent out a space or a room or an area or a unit on your property to subsidize your mortgage. All right, so this could be if you live in a home, let's say you buy a 2-bedroom, 2-bath, and you rent out 1 bedroom, 1 bath to somebody else. You're basically using that rent to subsidize your entire mortgage. But as you'll find out later in this video, there are actually several approaches that you can take that aren't just renting out rooms in your home. So you're gonna wanna stick around for those. But effectively, house hacking, rent out something on your property to help you pay your mortgage. I felt like a robot when I did that. House hacking. So now let me tell you my personal story with house hacking and ways that I saw it really starting to work, not just for me, but for other people. I remember before I started my full-time job, I was living in Texas and I got an internship opportunity to go live in Fayetteville, Arkansas to go intern at an ad agency out there. And I did that, but I didn't have anywhere to live. So I remember looking on Craigslist and I found a room for rent for $400. It was all bills paid. And then they're like, hey, occasionally when we make dinner, we'll give you some of our dinner. I was like, wow, this is great. I like talked to this person. It was like a wife and her husband. So I thought one time on the phone, I'm there, I'm moving in, I walk in, I remember they have a newborn like in a car seat or like in a bassinet. And I was like, oh, what's that? And they're like, oh, that's our baby. And I was like, you didn't mention that on the phone, but that's cool. And so I lived in this house and I remember they just treated me so well. Like very, very well, because what I came to realize was that $400 that I was paying them was like 75% of their mortgage. So they treated me like a celebrity there. You know, anything that I needed, they were like, hey man, what can we do for you? We really want you to stick around. And they were like really bummed when I moved. They never really understood why until they told me when I moved out that they're like, man, yeah, you know, your rent paid like 75% of our mortgage or something. And I was like, oh, that's cool. And so I saw how important it was to them, and that sort of stuck with me. And then I remember I bought my first house in Kansas City for $159,000. And I'm pretty sure my mortgage was like $1,059, so say $1,100. And my buddy was moving in from out of town, and I was like, dude, live with us. It'll be all bills paid. You know, it'll be $400 a month. And he was like, yeah, sure. He moves in, and I remember getting that first $400 paycheck, and I was like, holy moly.
Dear God, it's beautiful.
Like, I just made $400. My mortgage is now effectively like $700, whatever, right? And I was so excited because at that moment, we really didn't have a lot of money and we barely afforded to get into this house. So this extra $400, I guess $4,800 a year that was going into our pocket was a really big life-changing moment for us, because that's when I realized the power of having other people pay for my mortgage. Fast forward a couple of years and we end up buying a house in Los Angeles, California. Our house cost $624,000, and our mortgage on that property when we were first getting started, I think was like $4,400 or something like that. Now, going into that house, I knew we couldn't afford it. And I remember asking myself, how can I afford this house? Not, can I afford this house? I knew the answer was I couldn't afford this house, but I started asking myself, how? What could I do to make this house attainable for me? And so I remember I was looking for homes and I saw the home that we ended up buying, and it had a 279 square foot studio apartment underneath it. And at the time, this is when I was first starting to get into short-term rentals. And I had calculated that if I listed this studio apartment, even though it was 279 square feet on Airbnb, I was like, I think I can make $2,000 to $3,000 a month. And that's exactly what ended up happening. I ended up making $2,000 to $3,000 in rents every single month on Airbnb. And that was like life-changing money for me, because now my $4,400 mortgage was cut by 50 to 75% just with this studio apartment underneath, right? Wheels start turning. and I'm like, I'm gonna build a tiny house in my backyard. And I had a buddy that was moving to LA, and I was like, man, live in our guest room, pay us $800, and then once the tiny house is done, you can move there. And he was like, sure. So that $800 a month plus the $2,000 to $3,000 we were making on the studio was effectively canceling out my mortgage for the most part. And I was like, whoa, I'm no longer on the hook for $48,000 a year. What could I do with that money? And that was the money that I eventually used to invest in my own real estate portfolio and scale to the $10 million real estate portfolio that I have today, which is pretty cool, right? And not only that, eventually I ended up building that tiny house in my backyard, and that tiny house at its prime was making like $3,000 to $4,000 on Airbnb, and then I ended up moving it to a medium-term rental. But all to say, this Los Angeles property that I was so scared to buy cost me $624,000. I never ended up ever having to pay a mortgage on it, and that house today is worth anywhere from $1.25 to $1.3 million. So not only has it doubled in value, but I've never really had to pay the mortgage, which is really amazing. And when I loosely calculate what I've made on that property since I've bought it, I would say that I've collected between $225,000 to $250,000 in gross rents on that property. Now, the reason this is significant is because that's $250,000 that I never had to take out of my pocket to pay for this property. Instead, I use that $250,000 to continue investing in my portfolio. And that's the power of house hacking. It affords you the opportunity to afford a property, and then you can hold on to that property. And now that property, when it's really cooking for me on short-term rentals or medium-term rentals, can make me up to $8,500 a month, and that property's expenses usually run about $4,500 to $4,800 a month. So not only was it an amazing house hack, but it's also panned out to be a pretty amazing investment property too. All right, so now that you understand my personal story, maybe it can help you understand why I'm so passionate about house hacking. It helped me afford my first couple of homes. It's really been the Kickstarter and the catalyst and the gas on the fire for what would eventually become like the Rob Built real estate portfolio. And I'm just really thankful that I accidentally stumbled into house hacking. It's not like I knew what it was going into it. I just knew I could get other people to pay me rent. That was money that I was saving that I could use to go buy Chipotle and buy other homes, right? So let's talk about all of the different ways that you can house hack, all right? And we're gonna start with the very traditional model. This is where you own a home and you rent out a room in the home. I already gave that example when we started, all right? So that's the most traditional standard model of house hacking, all right? And this is gonna be for the person that's a little bit more of a communal person, someone that likes people, that likes interacting with people and doesn't necessarily mind other people being in their space, right? It's a very specific person, right? We house hacked with our friends. That's something that my wife was willing to agree to, but she would never, ever in a million years have house hacked with a stranger, which I would have been down for. Like I would have been like, yeah, whoever wants to come in and pay me rent, let's do it, right? She was like, no way. So this is really gonna come down to your personal preference, all right? But that's okay because this next model is actually the solution. And that's gonna be the duplex / multifamily route. So let's talk about what a duplex is. Typically, the duplex is 2 homes or 2 units on the same property. This is a really great route for house hacking if privacy is your jam, all right? Because instead of sharing a room and sharing personal spaces and doing all that kind of stuff, which is, you know, a lot of people aren't down for, a duplex, you know, you're in a whole different space, a whole different entry. People aren't in your living area. It's very private. And I've known a lot of people that have started house hacking this way because if you do this correctly, that other unit can pay for your entire mortgage. Sometimes you might even make a little money, depending on a few things. Are you long-term renting it, or are you listing it on Airbnb and making 2 to 3 times what you would make with the long-term rental? And if that's the case, it's not only possible to just pay your mortgage, but you can actually make money this way. This is gonna be for the person that's not particularly communal, but loves getting a free mortgage. All right, quick little pause from the video. We're talking about house hacking, and we've talked about ways that you can amp up the income of house hacking through Airbnb. So if you're interested in that space, or you're interested in getting into the world of Airbnb, consider booking a free call with my team over at hostcamp.com. It's my mentorship program, and the really cool thing is when you join, you get lifetime access to all of the coaching calls that we hold every single year. This is a new thing. It's a big deal. We have several calls a week, over 100 calls every single year, ranging from design to comping and analysis to automations. We have Ask a Superhost sessions and group coaching calls with your boy Rob. So if that all sounds good and you're interested in getting into the world of short-term rentals, head on over to hostcamp.com and back to the video. Now, you may not always be able to find a multifamily or a duplex out there, which brings us to option number 3, and that's an ADU, all right? An ADU is basically an accessory dwelling unit. So this, for example, could be when you have a single family residence. Let's say that you have a garage attached to that single family residence, and you decide to convert that into a living area. That living area can either be a bonus room, it can be a mother-in-law suite, or if you go through all the permitting and you abide by all the code, you could actually convert that to an ADU. Or you can do what I did, and I built a tiny house in my backyard, a 303 square foot tiny tiny home because I had this space on my lot. My lot was 6,500 square feet. I had this home that was a single family residence with this bonus studio apartment, and I had the lot at the very back of the property that was empty, and I decided to build my 2-story tiny home on that lot, and that was an ADU. So it's very close and it's very similar to the duplex model. The only difference is the home may not come with the ADU, and thus you may have to construct it, which is exactly what I did. So if you're the kind of person that like you're not necessarily relying on the income, but you do want the income, and maybe you have the money to build it, this is a great option because you can effectively buy a home, and if you're like, man, I really want this home, but it's a little more expensive than what I'm comfortable with, you have the option of building an ADU or sometimes an entire other house on the same property that you could then rent out to other people. Now, the reason that this strategy worked so well for me is because I had this house in LA, I built the tiny home, and because of that, I forced appreciation on this property, and my property skyrocketed in value. And so initially it was $624,000 when I bought it, but then my property appreciated because I added square footage and a whole nother living unit on it to like $800,000 to $900,000. I can't remember off the top of my head, but then I was able to cash out refi and pull all that money back out. And then I was actually able to use that money to reinvest in my Airbnb portfolio. So there are a lot of different benefits, not only house hacking, but new construction and increasing the equity in your home. Like, I don't want to get too in the nuts and bolts of it, but the reason I wanted to talk about this specific example is because it's a way for you to invest your money into a property and get it all back through a cash out refi, and then get the benefit of house hacking with the single family home and the ADU that you build. Hopefully that makes sense. And if it doesn't, leave a comment down below and I'll do my best to answer comments for the 1 hour after this video post. All right, now we get into the fourth way of house hacking, which is my personal favorite. I wish I had thought of this when I got into it, but I call this the supercharged house hacking route. And this is effectively where you still rent out a room on your property or an ADU or a duplex, but instead of renting it to long-term tenants and getting lower rents, you can consider renting it on Airbnb for much higher rents. So for example, in that Kansas City house, I was renting that room out to my friend for $400 a month, and I was really happy with that. But what I didn't know is that I could have listed that property on Airbnb for $50 a night. And if I had just rented that room for 8 nights out of the month, that would be the $400, and then we would have had our house to ourselves for the other 22 nights out of the month.
Just take those old records off the shelf.
But here's where it starts getting interesting. If we were in a really good location, which we were, and we rented at full occupancy, let's say 30 nights out of the month, which I'm sure would have happened every so often, well, 50 times 30 is $1,500. So instead of making $400 on a long-term rental, it was possible that I could have been making $1,500 on that one room, but it was a 3-2. My wife lived in one, we had 2 other rooms. It's possible that if we had rented both of those rooms on Airbnb, on a perfect month, we could have been pulling in $3,000 extra from Airbnb, and on that property my mortgage was $1,100. So I actually would have been making a profit of roughly $2,000 minus a few bills here and there, right? So hopefully the wheels are turning here, and you can kind of see how the Airbnb model really makes the house hacking thing start to soar. I mean, if we think about my tiny house in LA, that property would have been making $3,000 to $4,000 a month on Airbnb. Pandemic happened and we weren't super comfortable with a bunch of short-term rental guests coming in and out, so we ended up shifting to a medium-term rental, and we were charging $2,700 to $3,000. But the reason I was so interested in the short-term rental model on that is that that property, if I was making $3,000 to $4,000 a month, would have been $36,000 to $48,000 a year that I was pulling off of a 300 square foot home on a mortgage that was just over $4,000 a month. And so just that one tiny house alone sliced and diced my mortgage, and I got to live in my dream home in Los Angeles, California as a regular guy. Because I remember when we moved to LA, just the idea of buying a house was so crazy, and you watch these TV shows and they're like, oh, you have to be a multi-millionaire to own an LA, and suddenly we were living the dream just by house hacking. I like the Airbnb model for this reason, especially when we talk about things like the duplex strategy or the triplex strategy, where you live in a unit, you rent out 2 entire units on Airbnb. It can be a really life-changing thing. If you have a triplex and then you live in one, and both of your units you make $4,000 a month on each, it's like $8,000 that you make, $96,000 a year that you'll gross on that property that you can apply to a mortgage and hopefully break even at a minimum, but in the best case scenario, make thousands of dollars a month. Anyways, I could talk about the supercharged house hacking Airbnb strategy all day. It gets me excited. But again, the reason I love this strategy is because it unlocks so many doors for your wealth. And lastly, I haven't done this one, but this is interesting. I call it the New York model because I think it's really popular in New York. This is effectively house hacking when you don't even own the home. You basically go and you talk to the landlord and you're like, hey, you're in charge of the lease. And then you get your roommates and you rent to them, and you basically upcharge their rents to subsidize your rent. I've heard of people doing this. It seems relatively questionable to do this, and I even hesitated putting this in the video. What do you think about the New York model? Is it shady or is it fair game? And then as we wrap up, I wanted to talk about the downsides and the upsides. All right, so the downsides is if you're house hacking, this is gonna be particularly for the traditional model, but you're effectively living with roommates and sharing spaces. And even if it's a duplex or a triplex model or the ADU model, you're still sharing your property with other people, right? And so you may be more comfortable and more willing to do this if you're young and you're not married yet, because as soon as you get married and you start having kids, you start being a little bit more protective about who's on your property. But I think when you're first getting started, it's something to consider that the downsides here is you're sharing, right? It's community, it's communal. Whether it's in your home or on your property, it's definitely gonna be a downside for a lot of people. The other two downsides for this, and again, this is gonna be more for the traditional side, but you have to keep up with the cleanliness of everybody in your home. So if you have like 3 sets of roommates in this house hack, you gotta make sure that everybody is on the same page with cleanliness. And if you're the home leader or if you own the home, then you're the one that's keeping up with the tidiness, right? And even if it's the duplex model, like you have to worry about how tidy your tenant or your neighbor keeping the outside and their yard and everything like that. And then lastly, of course, this is like the big one, but when you're house hacking, the more roommates you have, the bigger risk you have of not liking your roommates. And if you're signing 12-month leases with people, you could get stuck with a roommate or multiple roommates that you don't like for a year. Now, the upsides of house hacking, I think, are relatively clear. A, other people are paying your mortgage, and this is important because they're paying down your principal, so your equity is growing every single month. And since other people are paying your principal down and paying your mortgage, you can now save that money that you would have paid towards your mortgage and apply it to your real estate investments. Or if you're not looking to necessarily build a crazy huge real estate empire, you can just pocket that money and use it as supplementary income. Like, I think that's equally an amazing reason to get into house hacking because, again, maybe you don't want to buy like 50 houses. How would $1,000 change your life? It would probably have some pretty big impacts, right? I remember when we were getting that $400, like, you know, we'd go to Chipotle every so often. Maybe I'd get the double steak. If I was feeling real bougie, I'd get the wok. This was before the queso days, but if they had queso, maybe every so often I would have gotten queso too. All because I was making an extra $400 every single month. And that extra $400 can eventually lead to over $200,000 in rents. And that over $250,000 of rents that you've collected over the past 5-6 years can eventually lead to a $10 million plus real estate portfolio. So with that said, I wanted to leave you with one particular recommendation. It's a book. It's called The House Hacking Strategy. It's by Craig Kurlop. He's part of the Bigger Pockets family, and he's sort of the expert on house hacking. It's a book that's worth its weight in gold if you're serious about getting into house hacking. I'm gonna leave a link in the description down below, or you can go to biggerpockets.com/house hacking, and when you use promo code ROB10, you'll get 10% off your book. You're welcome. You fired. You played yourself. That's my DJ Khaled, I guess.
You a genius.
But yeah, read that book. Ton of good information on there. But other than that, hopefully this has at least opened your mind. I have a feeling that a lot of you will watch this and send this to your business partner or your spouse and be like, see, look, Rob said to do it. And if so, let me know. Let me know if you end up pursuing house hacking. Big fan of this just because, like I said, it changed my life and I think it can change yours too. Cool? All right, catch you on the next episode of Rob Built.